Okay. Okay, I can see people trickling in, so we're just gonna give it a couple more minutes and we can begin. Sally, you can hear me okay, right? Yes, perfect. Okay, I think I'm seeing that the numbers have stabilized, so we can, I think, begin. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for yet another excellent, I'm sure, seminar, Funk Biogeography in Funk Biogeography seminar series. I'm Marta Jarzyna, and I'm a Vice President for Communications and Public Engagement for the Biogeography Society. Typically, I have some help from Raymond to introduce the speaker and to go through some of the organizational things, but he is otherwise occupied. So I will take over from him and go through some of the announcements that we have for you. And then I introduce Dr. Keith and we'll get on with the amazing presentation that we have here today. So just a note that if you're interested in some of the more technical aspects of our field, there is a number of workshops that are being offered through the Biogeography Society. So you can look at our website. Currently, we have rescheduled for either late 2024 or early 2025. If you're a member of the IBS, you'll be asked to pay a somewhat smaller fee than if you're a non-member. But check those out if you're interested in species distribution modeling or looking at changes across environmental gradients, that sort of stuff. There's some neat stuff that we have planned for the future. Likewise, you probably are aware that within a year and a couple of months, we'll have our next biennial conference coming up. This time we'll meet in Aarhus in Denmark. So that will be in January 2026. So mark your calendars. It's going to be another amazing meeting, I'm sure. Okay, so if you have any questions for Dr. Keith as she's speaking, feel free to put them in either the Q&A box or in chat, and then at the end of the seminar, I will read them aloud and repeat them for Dr. Keith. So just wait, we'll wait with asking these questions once after the seminar is done, basically. But you can put them at any time in there and they'll just be waiting for me to read them aloud when we're done. So yeah, thank you for attending again. Just a couple of links here. If you are interested in looking at this and maybe other talks in the future, we post all those seminars to our YouTube series, to our YouTube channel. So please check that out. If you want to become a member, it's very easy to do as well. Just go to our biogeography.org website. And if you want to publish with us, please check out our flagship journals, Frontiers of Biogeography. And with that, I will stop sharing my slides and I will let Dr. Keith share hers as I'm introducing her.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so let me just introduce you briefly. Dr. Keith is a senior lecturer at the Lancaster Environment Center and the environment team lead for the Data Science Institute at Lancaster University. She earned her bachelor's in zoology from the University of Southampton in 2004 which was followed by a master's in primate conservation from Oxford Brookes University. She then completed her PhD at Bournemouth University, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly, so apologies if I'm mispronouncing it. And then her research experience also includes postdoctoral and faculty positions in Australia and Denmark. After being in Denmark for a couple of years, she finally settled back in the UK at Lancaster University, where she currently works. Dr. Keefe's team coalesces around the new field of macro behavior, aiming to understand the links between animal behavior, species coexistence, and large-scale patterns in diversity and distribution. If you have not yet done so, I would really encourage you to take a look at Sally's recent papers. There is one paper on macro behavior in trends in ecology and evolution. It's a really truly fascinating read, but we will hear more about this today, as you can see from this first slide. More broadly, Dr. Keefe's work aims to advance ecological concepts and evidence in a way that is applicable across biomes and taxa, but she primarily focuses on coral reefs as a hyper-diverse model system. As we all know, coral reefs are one of the most threatened ecosystems in the world. So Dr. Keefe is on the mission to understand and predict how they might respond to environmental change in the future. So without further ado, I will let Dr. Keefe begin her presentation.
Okay, thanks very much, Marta. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. If not, somebody will have to tell me. So it's my pleasure to talk to you today about macro behavior. So I'm going to talk about a few different things today. So this talk is mostly split into two big sections. So first of all, I'm going to talk about whether macro behavior is a new dawn, and then zoom in on why I'm particularly focusing on competition and aggression. And then I'm going to talk about our attempts to actually try and understand aggression at scale. So trying to do macro behavior, essentially. And then just finish off by thinking about how we move forwards with the field. I'm going to have some funky boxes at the top there, just so you see where we are. Particularly for people in Europe, it's probably about home time. So I'll try not to spend too long. Okay, so is it a new dawn? Well, if we go back to the original book on macroecology by James Brown, he very clearly talks about behavior in that book. And he says behavior is causing or at least constraining large-scale patterns of distribution and abundance, both within and between species. So he already recognized this. And this was put out there right at the inception of macroecology. And he basically said that it was more a matter of practicality than philosophy for why behavior was not studied all that much at the beginning. And you can imagine why that is. It's quite difficult to go and record behavior in multiple locations in the field, which is what we generally need to do macroecology. Robert MacArthur as well, who is maybe even more relevant for this group in geographical ecology, so where he brought in basically the field of biogeography. He also flagged this early on. So he said the economics of species behavior is one of the 4 essential ingredients of all interesting biogeographic patterns. I'm sort of intrigued by that. What is a non-interesting biogeographic pattern? But there we go. So he also thinks behavior was important right from the beginning. The reason I think it's even more important now is because behavior is often the first response that species can make to any given change that happens around them. And as we know, that's all happening increasingly. So we've got things that might happen anyway that are happening with increasing frequency and severity. So things like forest fires and coral bleaching. And then we have things that are more clearly man-made. So things like invasive species like rats on islands and over-extraction. And so because of all of these things, we really need to be thinking about behavior and how that plays into larger scale patterns. So macro behavior, it tries to do this basically. So it tries to take those original ideas of Jim Brown and Robert MacArthur and kind of link that to, why we really need to understand this now. And we wrote this paper that came out end of last year that kind of solidified what this is. And this is taken heavily from the definition of macrophysiology with a few tweaks. So basically, macro behavior is the investigation of variation in behavior over large geographic, taxonomic, and temporal scales, and the ecological and evolutionary consequences of this variation. So it's a big field, basically. We like to think of it as a spectrum that you can dip into as much or as little as you want. So over on one side, we've got macroecological approaches and biogeographical approaches being applied to understand more classically behavioral questions. And an example of that is trying to understand parental risk taking by looking at survival probability and body size across latitudes. So by using a large geographical scale, we can start to tease apart what drives parental risk taking. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got behavioral approaches for tackling macroecological or biogeographical questions. And this is essentially trying to bring behavior in as a mechanism for creating the sorts of patterns that we're all interested in. And we have a few examples of this. One really nice one is by Freeman. So they have a couple of papers actually where they're looking at this kind of stuff, and they found that interspecific competition limits bird species ranges in tropical mountains because they're being aggressive towards one another. So behavior can offer an important explanatory variable in our kind of patterns. I think it's important as well to recognize that when we came up with this idea, we really, really wanted it to have reciprocal benefit. So not just us taking from another discipline. As macroecologists, we do that all the time. That's kind of what macroecology is, kind of a mashup of all these other disciplines, but to also make sure that it benefits behavioral ecology. So when we were writing this paper, it was a group of behavioral and macroecology people. So examples of benefits to behavioral ecology are that we can start to look at generalizability of theories and concepts. So are they just applicable to one location, which is what behavioral ecology has often focused on, or are they applicable across locations, across species? We can start to think about emergent properties, and so to do that, we need to look at larger scales, and we can use things like environmental change as natural experiments to try and understand behaviour. And of course, there's many benefits the other way as well to macroecology. Things like rapid behavioural change, which can mediate top-down drivers that we're more classically focused on. It can provide the missing link for the actual mechanisms that how those top-down drivers create different diversity and distributional patterns. And it can offer us greater predictive capacity as well. So as well as those two edges of the spectrum, right in the middle, we have this interdisciplinary area where we can come up with completely new questions and hopefully completely new approaches and ways of answering things. So I think there's a lot of questions that we haven't even begun to think about right now because we just haven't really brought the two communities together before. So that's sort of the next generation of macro behaviorists you can see in the middle there, possibly, if I can convince my children to do that. So one way I think is nice to imagine it is to think about a global map, because we're all very comfortable with that. We all love looking at that kind of stuff. And then think about our big processes, so speciation, extinction, movement, and maintenance as the four kind of big macroecological processes that are going on. And essentially, we can think about behavioral selection as happening against the backdrop of all of these processes. So you have to have a species pool first, and then you're going to get, well, do you? I don't know. But you're going to have your set species pool. And then depending on who's in that species pool, you are constrained in the types of behavior that can evolve. So we can think about behavior sort of playing out on the stage of macroecology. So is it a new dawn? No, I don't think it is at all. So think the sun has risen before, but it's also kind of set before. So people were talking about behavior very early on, but it seems to have sort of fallen out of the discussion around macroecology and biogeography. And I think now is the time to really bring it back in because particularly of rapid environmental change and offering a first response. Okay, so section number 2, zooming in on competition and aggression between species. So I'm sure you are all very familiar with this sort of checkered history of where it comes from. In particular, Jared Diamond proposed the 7 assembly rules back in the 70s for how different species are in different combinations across a bunch of islands. So he was looking at the Bismarck archipelago. And one thing he noticed in particular was that you sometimes get this checkerboard pattern where with pairs of species, they sometimes never occur in the same island. And he said that was down to competition between those species, and then came up with competition as quite a substantial part of those 7 assembly rules. What happened next was that Connor and Simbalov came along and said, but hang on, you need null models. You can't just assume that's generated by competition. It could just be a random pattern that we're seeing. So they wrote a paper just afterwards that had numerous quotes in. I've just included one here to sort of demonstrate how that discussion was going. So they said such an all-encompassing theory should be built on so little evidence invites an examination of the procedures used in its construction. So I think that's a bit of a strong takedown, really, for poor old Diamond, who was trying to come up with cool ideas. I mean, they're right about the null models, but you know, this had a bit of a back and forth for quite a while. Was still going on recently. So there was this paper in 2013 that was still looking at this history of checkerboard distributions and who was right and who was wrong. And I don't think it really helped encourage the community of biogeographers to be looking at species interactions and behavior, really. So, but it was starting to be done. But one thing that's really important is that co-occurrence patterns are not enough to be inferring that behavior is driving patterns or even competition, which is an outcome of behaviors. So even if they co-occur, we don't know whether they actually meet. So if you have some species that are always on the forest floor and some that are always in the canopy, they might never actually see each other. So we don't know whether they do compete. And then what happens if they do meet? Do they kind of belt up and get ready to have a big fight with each other, or do they make friends, or do they just completely ignore each other? So you know, there's lots of different options of what can happen, and I think we really need to understand this basically to try and get at what happens when species meet. So there's a few sort of very simple examples we can think about. So in terms of species range dynamics, so if you have species meeting very frequently, but they have a low intensity of interaction, a low intensity of negative interaction, then you probably can end up with some kind of coexistence scenario. If you have an intermediate frequency and intensity, then you might get some kind of depressed abundance where they co-occur, but they can still be there, and so they have some overlap. If you get rare encounters, but really high intensity when it does happen, then you might end up with competitive exclusion. So all this just to say, you know, it's more complicated than just do they meet or not, or do they co-occur or not. We need to know what happens when they meet. And then more recently, people from behavioral ecology have started thinking about this more as well. So from the behavioral perspective, this is often talked about as behavioral interference. And this can be either interference over mates, or it can be interference over food resources, interference over shelter, basically wherever things are fighting over stuff. And it's really important for underlying species coexistence. So it can impact species range limits, so it can set different range limits and how hard and fast they are. And it can also lead to invasion success predictions. So depending on how your species interact with one another and how they might interact with a new species coming in, then it could affect things to do with invasion dynamics. Can also ultimately impact character displacement, and it can either cause that to converge or diverge, depending on the interactions. And that can have a number of different outcomes, one of which is speciation. So you can see that we're starting to sort of link between behavior and those larger scale biogeographic processes. So they do have some quite strong dynamic links across scales, I think. Okay, so that's the end of this is what macro behavior is. So I'd just like to invite you to have a 20-second stretch. So just have a stretch around, either stand up or stretch where you are. Because we've probably all been sat down far too long today. And I haven't been counting, so I don't know if it's 20 seconds. Just gonna have one last stretch and then carry on. Okay, right, hopefully everybody joined in and didn't just watch me like I was a mad person there. Right, okay. So our attempts to understand aggression at scale. So all of these people, funders, have been working with me to try and start figuring this out, basically. And we've been doing this for a good few years now. So I want to thank all of these people for being involved. Okay, so as I showed you, we've got that spectrum that you can sort of dip into as much as you want or as little as you want, or not at all. And at one end, we have these macroecological approaches for behavioral questions, the other end, behavioral approaches for macroecological questions. So I'm just going to take you through two examples. The first of which is about maintenance of biogeographic borders, so species range limits. The second is thinking about the generality of economic behavior models and how by using this sort of macroecological approach, we can get at that. And we are doing or trying to tackle this interdisciplinary messy middle bit, but I'm not going to present that today because it takes quite a lot longer to get into. It is a lot more messy and we just don't have time, but I would be happy to talk about it some other time. Okay, so I'm going to start off with this maintenance of biogeographic borders. So as Marta said, I work a lot on coral reefs as my model system, but have jumped around from plants to primates to barnacles to all sorts of things. So butterfly fish are these guys here. They're a really useful system to study. So they all, nearly all eat corals. So they're corallivores, which means they're really important in coral reef ecosystems. And they're often seen as kind of sentinels of the system because they can be the first impacted if we have any problems with corals in the system. There's about 60 different species that eat coral to greater or lesser degrees. Some are obligate corallivores, so they can only eat coral, and some are facultative, so they substitute their diet with algae, other invertebrates that live in the coral, and stuff that they find in the water column. They're also really easy to identify in the field, which is very, very helpful if they're the first fish group you've ever studied. So that was another good reason for me. And they have very clear aggression. So particularly the obligate corallivores, they'll claim a particular coral as their territory. So these guys in the bottom left-hand corner, they like the big table corals that you sort of see in iconic Blue Planet type programs. And they will chase off anyone that tries to come and bite their coral. So very clear aggressive behavior that you can record underwater. I'm going to attempt to show a video. We'll see if this works on the old Zoom. Hopefully you're not just seeing a horribly jerky thing. You can see them chasing each other around there. You've got one species chasing another species, and they're actually sister species as well. So the cool thing is that they don't just chase within their species, they chase heterospecifically and conspecifically. So it also lets us ask these big kind of questions of them. So the main question I started trying to answer was whether behavioral interference, so basically them fighting, can maintain species borders. One of the reasons I thought this might be the case is because we have this kind of schematic. So this is very simplified, but in general, we have a bunch of butterfly fish that occur in the Indian Ocean, in that blue patch, another bunch of species that occur in the Pacific Ocean, in that green patch, another bunch in Japan, another bunch in the Red Sea and Persian Gulf, and another bunch in the Far Eastern Pacific. And there's generally sister species. So you kind of flip from one group of species to another group, which often has sister species in there. And you get this sort of, what's the word? Not continuum, because there's a split between them, but you know what I mean, as we move along geographically. And so, you know, there's sort of an obvious question of, well, why does it stop there? Why does the range stop there? Because they obviously can all get to that point because they have these overlapping ranges in certain locations. So it's probably not dispersal. They're sister species, so they have very similar resource requirements. So maybe it's that they evolved in these two different locations, they've made secondary contact, and now they're behaviorally interfering and stopping each other spreading further. So I wanted to go to these locations where we had this overlap of sister species to see if the sister species were fighting particularly aggressively compared to other species. So we went to these locations you can see on the map at the top. Ignore those little box plots for now, just look at the circles. So these 5 regions across the Central Indo-Pacific. So we went to Aceh, Bali, Christmas Island, the Philippines, and Japan. All of these were locations of range overlap, except that Central Philippines one, which is labeled as Luzon there. So that was kind of our control region where we didn't have different species overlapping. So we went out and we collected a bunch of aggression data between all the different species. So in general, in a given reef, we would have somewhere between about 12 and 24 butterfly fish species on that reef, all fighting each other. So we collected the aggression data by following an individual for 5 minutes. If it had an encounter with any other butterfly fish of any species, as long as it was in the same genus, that was if they came within 1 meter of our focal individual, recorded as an encounter. If they ignored each other, that was a passive encounter. And if they signaled or chased each other, that was an aggressive encounter. And we recorded how far they chased one another. So sometimes it could be 10 centimeters. I think the longest one that I followed them chasing each other for was about 50 meters, which is a really long way when you're trying to swim underwater following some very fast fish. We also recorded data on their feeding behavior, because the idea was that they're aggressive because of their overlap in what they're eating. So we needed to know if that was true by getting the feeding information. And then we also recorded the abundance of both the butterfly fishes and the corals that they were eating. So we had to make sure we had the abundance, because we had to rule out things like are they just bumping into each other more because there's more of them in a given location, for instance. So we went and got all these data. So we went across 5 different countries, 17 reefs, got more than 5,000 aggression observations. I think that's gone up now. About 2,500 feeding observations across 38 different species of butterfly fish. So this massive data set was really cool and really exciting. But there was a bit of a problem. So my original idea was looking at sister species in particular, if you remember. And what we found when we actually went to these locations is generally, if there's sister species there, you might see 1 or 2 individuals of one species and then a fair amount of the other species, which meant that if we're trying to record aggression interactions, we end up with a sample size of 1 or 2, which meant we could say absolutely nothing to answer this question. So I just think this should be put up there as an epic fail, particularly for early career people who worry about this kind of stuff. I think it's really normal in science to fail on stuff, and it's okay. And if you are trying to do new stuff, you often fail. Anyway, so that was a big failure, but it got us thinking about lots of other questions and got us a massive data set. Just after we finished collecting these data, as luck would have it, it wasn't very good, but it was useful scientifically. The biggest ever global coral bleaching event started to happen. So it happened in Hawaii first. That was where it's first recorded. Moved on to Australia, Japan. So this is actually where our field sites were. Maldives, the US. So it was everywhere, and it was really, really, really bad. So this gave us an opportunity research-wise, because suddenly we had this natural experiment that had been replicated across a really large geographic extent, and we had before data. So we needed to go and get the after data to see what happens with aggression when you have resource depletion. So this is the site in Japan, and you can see from 2016 covered in beautiful corals, and 2017, a lot of that coral was dead and overgrown. So this sort of brings me on to the second bit, where we then started looking at economic behavior models and using these large-scale approaches to understand those in a different way. And I promise we will come back to biogeography in a few minutes. So we had two key questions. First of all, what's the effect of mass coral mortality on butterfly fish aggression? And then, do economic behavior models offer a plausible explanation? So this is a really common way of thinking about stuff in behavior, which is basically cost benefit type models. If I do this behavior, what's the cost of doing that and what's the benefit I get from it? And depending on the outcome of that, I decide whether to do it or not. So this is what our economic behavior model looks like when we think about the probability of aggression given resource abundance. So aggression is thought to be, or hypothesized to be highest when you have intermediate resource abundance. The reason for that is if you have really high resource abundance, nobody needs to bother fighting. So there's enough food for everyone. There's no point investing your time in a fight. But as the resource decreases, it becomes more valuable. So you would expect aggression to increase because now it's worth you fighting to get hold of that resource. When we go further and we have an even greater decrease in resource abundance, then you just don't get enough benefit anymore from defending whatever it is you're eating. It's too much work to fight. So the cost starts to outweigh the benefit, so it should go down. So this is what we wanted to test. So when we think about it for the butterfly fish, we have the bleached reefs, the after reefs on the left-hand side, and the healthy reefs on the right-hand side. And we didn't know where they were starting from. We didn't know the starting position for this, so we didn't know what was going to happen at all. So here's that map again, the sites we went to, and those box plots you saw earlier were actually percent coral cover before and after the mass bleaching event. You can see that all four of the ones that were in species contact zones had a significant decrease in coral cover, whereas the one in the Philippines didn't, which was very useful for us because we had a control region. So thanks, Philippines, for doing that. And so we basically went back and looked at how aggression changed when we had a significant depletion of resources. This first one on the left is the Philippines before and after. And you can see there's no significant change in the amount of aggression. If anything, it's gone up slightly. Whereas when we look at the other three, where we had this big drop in resource, we had a massive drop also in aggression probability. So if the economic model offers a plausible mechanism for that, that must mean that we're sort of on this side where aggression is decreasing because the cost is starting to outweigh the benefit. So we must have gone down. So we must be over this side of what's going on. So that means we have to look at what they were eating, try and figure that out. And it turns out that it did fit really nicely because butterfly fish were eating fewer acropora corals. Just chucked up a picture there of Andrew Baird, who was really instrumental in collecting these data. So thanks, Andrew, for that. So acropora corals are thought to be much more nutritious than other corals, and they're the preferred food of butterfly fishes. So we think they kind of essentially went from this situation in 2016 of having like really nice, nutritious, big roast dinner type meals to just having to pick on other corals being able to survive, but maybe not thriving because they didn't have as high a nutrition value. So it does seem to fit with that idea of the economic model, which was cool. And then the last thing we wanted to try and figure out was whether this was a new normal. So had this been created because we've lost the individuals that fight because of natural selection? Or is it the same individuals, but they've been plastic in their behavior, and so it could revert back if we have an increase in resource abundance? So does it go back up here, essentially? So my recent postdoc, Lisa Boster-Meinesen, had a look at this. And so this is the data from what you've already seen, so 2016 to 2017. So we have a decrease in the coral, particularly in acropora. So if you look on the right-hand side, the yellow boxes are the acropora, so those nutritious corals. They've gone down significantly. And you can see on the left-hand side, we've got a drop in aggression as well. These are on slightly different scales from what you saw before, so don't worry, it doesn't match perfectly, but just trust me, it went down. And what we actually saw with a big COVID splat in the middle, where we couldn't get back out there, was that we did have an increase in aggression again, which coincided with an increase in coral cover as well. So what that suggests to us is that aggression does revert to pre-disturbance levels when you have coral recovering, which is pretty cool because it kind of suggests that that behavioral modification can offer a way to buffer the effects of environmental change. So what was the effect of mass coral mortality on butterfly fish aggression? So they decrease their aggression. And do economic behavior models offer a plausible explanation? Yes, they do, which is quite cool. And so it allowed us to put behavior in this sort of bigger context and test its generality across multiple locations and multiple species at a community level, which hadn't really been done before. So the implications of this, so as I said, we've got this generalized response to environmental change that we've been able to use using these macroecological methods. We seem to have this breakdown of territoriality going on, which is being backed up by a few other things we've been looking at recently. We've got this short-term plasticity, which is really interesting because it means that behavior and behavioral shifts might confer increased resilience. But that seems like it could also disrupt coexistence mechanisms. So we're also looking at stuff around intransitive competition, which if you've never heard of is rock, paper, scissors between species. And if you took a rock, a paper or a scissors out, you can imagine you've got a sudden cascade of death, basically, in the community. And also thinking about whether instead of the obligates being the dominant species, whether it could switch to facultative. So you've got quite a lot of things that could be going on in there. And just to pull it right back to biogeography, so if you remember earlier on, I was talking about how behavioral interference can affect all sorts of things. So invasion success, for example, character displacement. So if we have these kind of large-scale environmental changes that feed into behavioral shifts and behavioral modifications, it could alter species range limits, exacerbate local extinctions, facilitate character displacement, and even potentially lead to speciation. So I think it's got quite a lot of implications for them building up to biogeographic patterns. Okay, so last section, we're going pretty well here. Moving forwards with macro behavior. So what are we doing now and next? So with macro behavior, I think what we can do is some cool stuff. So in particular, find and test general principles to explain behavioral variation across large scales. And this is where people with biogeographic skills need to come into the mix. This is a massive field with so many unanswered questions. There are already people that have been doing this kind of stuff, and the idea of creating macro behavior as a field is to coalesce what's already being done as well as ask new questions and bring new people in. There's so much to do in this space. So if you're interested in that, use your biogeographic skills and knowledge to start mapping the crap out of behavior, basically. Let's see what we can find out. We can start to try and understand how behavior scales up to influence other kinds of patterns and ecological dynamics above population levels. So often behavioral ecology stops at sort of population level, goes very, very much into depth below that, but hasn't really managed to make the connection above that yet. we can understand current and crucially get better at predicting future responses to environmental change. So when you think about things like species distribution models, perhaps they sometimes fail because we don't have behavioral things in there, and we might be able to um, improve those quite dramatically by putting in key behaviors. And we can just develop some new fundamental questions, transcending both disciplines, that would just be really cool to start trying to ask and answer. We can also have quite a big impact potentially on conservation. So this is Dr. Richa Karkari, who works in our group. She's a Nat Geo fellow. And she's been looking at behavior distribution and abundance of grouper spawning aggregations under different levels of fishing pressure by going around this archipelago and looking at different locations, and finding some really cool stuff about how they behave very differently under fishing pressure and how that could ultimately interfere with their reproduction, population dynamics, and then ultimately where they're distributed if certain spawning aggregations fail. And her work is just starting to be put into conservation action plans for the region in the Lakshadweep archipelago in India where she works. So we can have some really big impacts potentially in that space. But we need collaboration to do this kind of stuff, and data. So we need to not only think big, so we're used to thinking big, we need to also think small about the data. So we need small grain, large extent data to start bringing behavior in. And I think a lot of the time we just sort of think, well, I can't possibly go and collect behavioral data. So we obviously need to collaborate with behavioral people, but they probably think, well, I don't need to collect it in multiple locations. I'd just collect it here. So we can say, actually, it'd be really useful if you collected this in multiple locations. So we need to come together and do this sort of work as one. And we can get data from, by mining what's out there already. There's a lot of stuff in natural history, books, for example, field guides, things like that are just these really untapped resources at the moment. And when we're thinking about species level behavior, we can turn to modeling. So some stuff we might not be able to get at. And we also probably need multiple lines of evidence because behavioral data is often quite messy to disentangle from other stuff. But we really do need to go out in the field and collect primary data as well. And I think we shouldn't shy away from that, either doing it ourselves or working with behavioral people who are out there anyway and try and create coordinated networks, for example, of behavioral data collection. And I completely forget why I've put that picture in. Maybe just because I like seeing a picture of the world. Can't remember. But I guess thinking about how we need to scale this up as well and use all of our biogeographic skills, geospatial kind of analysis. And we really do need this collaboration. So I think it's really important with something like this when you're trying to work across disciplines, and these are really sub-disciplines, right? They're still in ecology, but we still have this massive gap in how we talk to one another. So in writing this macro behavior paper, it took us quite a long time to make sure we were talking with a common language about things. And so you've really got to try and create groups or relationships where it's okay to ask the stupid questions because they're probably not stupid, and you're fine with also trying to answer those questions. And it does take extra work trying to get that going, but it's really rewarding when you start to get these new kinds of insights and ideas. So at a similar time, so last year as well, there was another paper that came out, which is really instrumental in thinking about this, which was led by Katie Marsky and involves her colleagues from University of Oklahoma, which is about integrating biogeography and behavioral ecology to rapidly address biodiversity loss. So if you haven't read that paper, I'd strongly suggest you go and read it. It's a real tour de force of all the evidence in this area that we have so far and where the gaps are. It's really, really cool. And talking about collaboration, so Katie and I recently put in a proposal to SDIV, which you're probably all fairly familiar with, but the German sort of synthesis center, and have just found out that we've got that. So we have a new project just starting called S Macro Behavior, which has a group of 13 of us in a working group that will meet 2 to 3 times over the next 2 years. And the big thing that we're doing is mobilizing data on species level behavioral traits. So that data is going to become open access once it's assembled. And for now, just cover vertebrates. We thought 60,000 species was probably enough for the moment. If anyone wants to start creating one for invertebrates as well, that would be awesome. So mobilizing those species level behavioral traits, we're going to link it with species distribution data, and then start creating sort of maps of behavioral trait distributions to ask lots of interesting biogeographical questions, hopefully. So if you're interested in getting access to those, hopefully in another couple of years, that will be freely available to everyone. So do start thinking of the questions you might want to ask using those data, because they will be there. And we can really start moving forwards with mapping this kind of stuff and trying to understand how it works through space and time. So that's it. So this is the paper that Marta referred to with a QR code that hopefully still links to it, which unpacks those ideas a little bit further. So if you're interested, please feel free to go and have a read of that paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sally. This was really interesting. There's already some questions in the QA box, so how about I read them out?
Yeah.
First question is from Tarakan Fight, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. How does macro behavior consider genes? Because genes influence behavior and vice versa. So do you
Yes.
consider genes when thinking about macro behavior?
Yeah, sure. Why not? So I just think one of the ways I imagine macro behavior, it's like this sketch that we've created so far, based on what a lot of other people have already done. And I think it's up to the whole community to now fill in this sketch, stick bits on, color bits in, rub bits out if we need to. If you can think of a way to link in genetics and genomics, please do go ahead and try and do that, because you're right, it clearly has a strong impact, not just in terms of genetics, but also epigenetics, probably going to be pretty important for behavior. I think it also is really important, as I was talking at the beginning, with the constraints on what behaviors can evolve depending on what species pool you've got there to start with. So there might be kind of genetic, physiologically linked limitations to what behaviors can evolve in a given place. So Katie, who I just mentioned, does a lot of geography stuff. So she's been thinking about this a little bit as well, and some of her colleagues at University of Oklahoma. So it's probably a really unsatisfying answer, but yeah, please tell me the answer one day.
Cool. All right. Well, the next question is from Rafaela Nunes. When researching behavioral changes after disturbances such as coral bleaching, is there a standard of time to understand if these changes are actually natural selection or the species behavior is just plastic?
Yeah, so that's what we were trying to disentangle in that, going back and looking what's happened. So the generation time of butterfly fish is about 7 years. So if we'd only seen those changes in behavior after sort of 7 odd years, we could start to think that maybe this is a natural selection thing. And it could be that, well, yeah, I don't know actually. Because I guess natural selection, you would expect them to just disappear, but not necessarily come back as well, because you might lose those genes from the population. Anyway, with ours, there was a few different reasons why we thought it was probably behavioral plasticity rather than natural selection, partly to do with the generation time of butterfly fish, partly to do with the amount of abundance change. So there wasn't a big change in abundance, which sort of suggested that it was behavioral shifts with the same individuals being there. Anecdotally, there were still some of the same individuals being there, so that you get these occasional hybrid individuals where they have these really funky patterns, which is kind of a mix from the two species that they're from. And I saw those same individuals there each time we went back. So they do have really high site fidelity, and kind of stay in that location in one, over time. Um, but I think it's a really important question to try and get at. It's difficult to do, and we haven't done it perfectly. Just the weight of evidence suggests that it's probably plasticity. But I think it's really important because in a sort of conservation context, if you've completely lost a behavior because of natural selection, you're unlikely to get it back. So any kind of mitigation measures to try and do that would need to bring new individuals into a population. Whereas if it's behavioral plasticity, you can potentially have a reversion to that behavior quite fast on recovery of the system. And then if you think about how that behavior links to population dynamics and coexistence, you can sort of follow through up the scale. So for instance, one of the things we think is potentially happening with butterfly fish but couldn't test because of COVID is that although they're still eating enough to survive, that they don't have enough energy left over to reproduce, because there's often this big time lag that you see with butterfly fish abundance dropping. So, there's these sort of higher level dynamics going on, and also disruption of species coexistence. We've sort of got suggestions that that's going on as well.
Great. I mean, so just to follow up on this question, I guess, and your answer, you know, traditionally, if we want to disentangle plasticity from natural selection, we have to do, I don't know, a common garden experiment or something like that. I imagine that that would be very difficult to do in a system like yours, right?
Yes. Yeah. So it's difficult to do because, it's a system that's in trouble anyway. So the ethics of moving things about is quite hard.
Right.
Or removal experiments, it's also, you don't really want to go killing your butterfly fish. And there's just not that many of them. So our sample sizes are limited by the number of fish on the reef. So we do this sort of swimming pattern that means that we try and get every individual without repeating individuals.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, it would be very difficult to manipulate that system. It could be done, but maybe using species that are less at risk, probably, in which case they probably wouldn't respond as strongly.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. One other question from Andres Marmol. How far are we to incorporate behavioral data into biodiversity and ecosystem modeling for biodiversity losses assessment? I
Mm.
assume that the person is asking about whether we should be and how important it is to incorporate behavior into our
Yeah, so
assessments.
how important it is an open question, I think. So by being a proponent of we should explore behavior, what I'm definitely not saying is that behavior needs to go into every model.
Mhm.
So models should always be as simple as possible for uh, predicting whatever thing you're interested in predicting, right? So we don't want to chuck in behavior there if we don't need it. But if behavior is having a really strong influence on some of your ecosystem processes, then you probably do want to start putting it in there. I think probably if you're thinking about the ecosystem scale, it would need to be species level traits that you're doing. If you're looking at smaller scales, then you might want to start thinking about variation within populations. So you can have quite a lot of population variation, which can bring you into sort of game theory type ideas about what's the best frequency of different behaviors in a population for delivering particular functions. So I think there's a lot of questions to get at there. So I've been starting to think about that in terms of applying a response and effect traits framework, whether you could have behavioral response traits and a behavioral effect traits and look at the links between those, and whether certain response traits are more susceptible to certain types of environmental change, how correlated they are with the effect traits. And so if you lose a bunch of certain species due to some environmental change thing going on, are you also going to lose a bunch of effect traits at the same time, or are they spread across different response behaviors?
Mhm.
So I think there's a few different ways we can get at that. it's definitely a question worth investigating. But the answer might be we don't need to put behavior in, which would be fine.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense what you just said. I also am wondering because, like, if we're interested in things like, species responses to climate change, which is, a lot of us are interested in that, being able to understand how species respond and use that knowledge to predict what will happen with them in the future. I feel like behavior has this, it's really unique in a way. Maybe I'm wrong, and correct me if I'm wrong. It seems to be more plastic potentially
Hmm.
than a lot of other traits, right? So it might be like the first thing that species change in response to changing climatic on or environmental conditions in general.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I feel like it's almost like it gives us this great opportunity had we had this data to be
Hmm.
able to make more sound predictions potentially. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's why it's really important to look at now is that it is this like rapid response thing that species have. And it can kind of go both ways. So it can help them deal with environmental change, but it can also hinder. So if you have behavioral plasticity, it can actually prevent or slow down genetic adaptation by
Mm.
reducing selection pressures. So even if they can sort of survive with a behavioral plasticity, in some ways it might be better for them to get a stronger selection pressure and genetically adapt so that they can then thrive under those things. So yeah, I think it's really important to look at, and it's a bit more nuanced with a lot more possibilities than might be obvious at first thought.
That's interesting. Another question from an anonymous attendee. Would it be worthwhile to distinguish behavior of the fish to defend their place or resources versus aggression to take over another place or resource?
Hmm. Yes, I'm not sure how we would identify that in the field is one thing, and I very strongly think we need to be looking at behavior in the field because behavior out of context, we can start to understand neurological mechanisms behind it and stuff, but doesn't really tell us what species would do in response to changes. Um, so I don't really know how you would get at that. Um, what we do see though is this, with the reduction in aggression is this kind of change of strategy from the ones that are really aggressive and really hold a very clear territory. They start to almost be like roamers if their coral has died. So they start sort of roaming around and picking off bits of coral from everywhere else. So they don't really seem to hold a territory anymore. Whereas the same different individuals of the same species a few meters down, their coral might be okay. And they still have this really aggressive way of behaving. So they definitely sort of decide to do different things. Um, and I guess when the coral comes back, that's when you might start thinking about aggression because things are starting to take territories from other ones. Um, but we haven't got the data to look at that, and I'm not. Yeah, I'd be interested to try and think through how you would disentangle that.
Mhm. Cool. Well, thank you very much. We're almost out of time, so I think we'll just let you go. Thank you very much for being willing to come and give an amazing talk for everyone. I will stop recording now.